All right, hello everybody. So I hope everyone is doing well, and we are going to start our lecture today. This is part one for week 3, and today we're looking at the end of the Goryeo dynasty and the establishment of the next dynasty, the Joseon dynasty. Again, this is a continuation of our look at political history. And so today we're going to look at how the government was set up during the Joseon dynasty, and then how the Joseon dynasty interacted with other political entities in the region. So if you recall from the end of the Goryeo dynasty, there was quite a bit of political disorder and social unrest. We'll go over the social unrest a little bit later in future lectures, but with the decline of the Yuan dynasty, so the Mongols being pushed out by the Ming dynasty, this then provided an opportunity for Korea. So at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, as we mentioned in the last lecture, we saw a reversal of fortune for the government officials. So although the military officials had staged a coup d'etat and were in power with the rise of the Mongols, the civil officials were able to reassert themselves. And so by the end of the Goryeo dynasty, we have a lot of fluctuation within the government and also some flip-flopping with the king. The king, even though, as we saw, the king had pretty much been a son-in-law of the Mongols, he then saw the rise of the Ming dynasty and chose to take a anti-Mongol and pro-Ming stance. So we see this political disorder internally. Externally, what we see is as the Mongols are being pushed up north. So they're being kicked out of the Chinese mainland and they're being pushed up north. As you can imagine, as they move into these territories and they start displacing other tribes and other established states, they come into conflict with these people, and they also come into conflict along this northern border here. And so this northern border becomes quite contentious, and there's a lot of fighting back and forth. And then also at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, we also see a problem with piracy. So Korea, being a peninsula, is surrounded by coastline, and there were Japanese pirates that were based out of these southern Japanese islands, remote islands here. They were not just ethnically Japanese, but they were a mixture of peoples from around this area. But they started wreaking havoc along the Korean coastline and then also along this southwestern coastline of the Chinese mainland. And when Japanese pirates would attack, they would come in and they would steal and rape and pillage, but they would also burn everything down. And so by the end of the Goryeo dynasty, we have a lot of dissatisfaction and disruption because the Goryeo people had to flee into the mountains. They had to leave the coastline and flee into the mountains for safety. And then when you abandon your farms and your fields and your homes, then you're not producing rice or food, and the government is unable to collect taxes. So it's a mess by the time we get to the end of the Goryeo dynasty. All right, so the Ming dynasty has consolidated and they are driving out the Yuan dynasty by 1387. In 1388, they set up a military commandery here in this northeastern region. So it's just on the border with the Goryeo dynasty. And the Ming dynasty, being an expansionist dynasty, the Koryo dynasty was concerned that the Ming dynasty would then start to attack the Koryo dynasty. So the Koryo dynasty organizes military forces to preempt this. And what we have at the end of the Koryo dynasty, we have these kings that are relatively weak, and they are ruling over a crumbling dynasty. And so the last king, King Gongyang, he resigns, and what we have is a military general, Yi Seung-ge, who then takes over the throne in 1392. So how this happened was Yi Seung-ge, he was commanded by the king to take his military forces up to the northern area and to attack the Ming dynasty. Now, just looking at the map here, do you think this is a good idea? The Ming dynasty has consolidated. They are at the height of their military power, and they are continuing to expand. And so Yi Seung-ge, he takes his troops and they start heading north, but on the way he decides this is a suicide mission. If we go up against the Ming, they're just going to annihilate us. So he turns his troops back around and then drives out the last king of the Koryo dynasty. The official records say that he was urged to take on the kingship and then to set up a new dynasty, but really, who knows what happened. So he takes the throne in 1392, and this then begins the new dynasty, the Joseon dynasty. All right, so Yi Seung-ge, he had set up this new dynasty, but the question is, right, from the very outset of the Joseon dynasty, the question is how to establish a dynasty that is going to last for as long as possible and to provide stability. So you want a long-lasting, stable government, and these were issues that Yi Seung-ge and his officials, his supporters, were dealing with. And it was essential for them to try to come up with some kind of a plan when they were structuring this new government. And the need for this became apparent soon after Yi Seung-ge took the throne, because he soon after started experiencing succession problems. So he takes the throne. He has 2 wives and 8 sons. The 8 sons have 2 different mothers. And he decides to appoint his youngest son as the crown prince to succeed him. So you can imagine that his older brothers are not happy about this. So the 5th son kills him. The 5th son and the 8th son, they had different mothers. So the 5th son kills him, and he also kills some other brothers. He then appoints as the crown prince the second to oldest. The oldest son had already died at this point. So the second to oldest, he appoints, this is the 5th son, he appoints as the crown prince, but he's essentially a puppet king. And he eventually steps aside. But during this time, the younger brothers, so for example, the 4th son, he also attempts to revolt and tries to take over. And so what we have is this power struggle among the sons, and they are killing each other. So finally, the 5th son, he then is appointed as the crown prince because his older brother has stepped aside, and he becomes Taejong, who is the 3rd king. Taejong was a very tough king. He understood that it was imperative to put the new dynasty on a firm foundation. And he also wanted to establish the kingship as a very, very strong kingship. So as a result, he took very tough measures. His queen was from the Min family, and the queen had placed her brothers in very high positions in the government, and they started meddling in political affairs. Well, Taejong did not like this. He did not like his brothers-in-law meddling in political affairs. So what he did was he had them executed, and he killed them. So we can see that because he was so ruthless in a way, he had no problems with killing his brothers, his half-brothers, or his brothers-in-law in order to maintain and solidify power. But what we have also at the same time is a very, very strong king that now goes about and implements major institutional reform because he understands that it is necessary to revamp the government in such a way that it's going to be stable and long-lasting. So the way that the government was structured was you have the throne or the king, and then you have the bureaucracy, the government officials. So this made up the central government, and the bureaucracy was made up of two sets of officials, the military officials and the civil officials. So this is something that we saw also during the Goryeo dynasty. These two sets of officials, military and civil officials, they are called the Yangban. And Yangban literally translated means both sides, because when the king would oversee government affairs, his officials would line up in front of him with the civil officials on one side and the military officials on the other side. So Yangban means both sides. That's both sides of these officials, or the military and civil officials. So this was the basic structure of the government, but over time, and this is a recurring theme in Korean history and also many other histories of the world, there is a struggle for power between the throne and the government, and bureaucracy, between the king and his officials. So at the beginning of the dynasty, because Taejong was this very strong king, we have an increase of power of the king, and so the bureaucracy has less power, but this then changes over time. All right, so there was fiscal reform that was carried out at the beginning of the dynasty. There had been a lot of land that had been forcefully taken and being used for private use, and there was a lot of land that had been given to Buddhist temples. We'll talk about this later when we discuss Buddhism. But these lands were either tax-free, because Buddhist temples, they were exempt from taxation, or they were unregistered lands that the people who had taken over them were not paying taxes on. And so if we have this decrease in tax revenue, that means that the government is in fiscally bad shape. And so the government, the Joseon dynasty, decided that they were going to enact fiscal reform, and this meant conducting a new land survey. So they conducted a land survey, they confiscated lands that were formerly used by the temples or that had been illegally taken and occupied, and so they confiscate all of this land and they turn it into public land, which means that it's owned by the government. The government has the right to collect taxes from it. So this is about redirecting revenue from private individuals to the government. So this is how the government increases its tax revenue and tries to get fiscally sound. Military reform was also conducted. So private armies, these local warlords that had existed throughout the country and had their own private armies, all of these were abolished, and a standing army was created. So this is a kingdom-wide standing army. And looking back on the Goryeo dynasty and the Silla dynasty, the Joseon dynasty understood the importance of abolishing these private armies so that you don't give too much power to these local warlords, because then they can rise up and try to overturn the government. And there was political institutional reform that was enacted. So by the time we get to the end of the Goryeo dynasty, many high officials, so that there were a few officials who were extremely powerful, and they were powerful because they held concurrent appointments, which means that they held multiple appointments at the same time. So to just give you a modern day example of how that would work, let's say that I am the owner of Samsung. But not only do I own Samsung, I'm also the president, I'm also the CEO, I'm also chairman of the board, so I hold all of these concurrent appointments. Now, is this a good or a bad thing? In general, when we look at overall governance, this is looked at as negative because there's a concentration of power in one individual. You know, if I hold all of these positions at the same time, that means that I can act like a virtual dictator and I can make all of the decisions. So at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, there were a few officials who were able to gain a lot of power because they held concurrent appointments and they monopolized the highest positions in the government. So the Joseon dynasty, they got rid of this. They said you cannot hold more than one of these positions at the same time. They also established the Council of State. And so the Council of State, what this did was it was a policy-making organization, and so they would make policy recommendations to the king, and this helped the king on how to devise the best policies. There were 6 ministries that were established, and again, these ministries reported directly to the king. Whereas before, these ministries would often report to the Council of State. During the Joseon dynasty, it was changed so that they report directly to the king. There was a security council that was established, and the security council was made somewhat weaker. A royal secretariat, which was in charge of handling all of the transfer of documents, official documents within the government, and again, this reported directly to the king. And then there were these 3 agencies. So the Office of the Inspector General, which was like a surveillance agency to make sure that the officials were behaving properly and to cut down on corruption. Any kind of misbehavior would then be reported directly to the king. There was an Office of the Censor General, which would review policy and offer criticism or advice, and an Office of Advisors, which was like a brain trust. So what we see through this political institutional reform is not just a dispersal of power. So rather than power being concentrated in a few individuals, we have a dispersal of power, but also most importantly, the strengthening of the throne, because all of these different organizations now report directly to the king. So this is really a move to try to strengthen the kingship. So we have this dispersal of power. That is a dispersal of bureaucratic power, the government officials. Now, why would the central officials go along with this? Why would they willingly have their power either decreased or taken away? Well, one reason might have been because since Taejong, the third king, was so powerful, they didn't have a choice. Another reason would have been that these officials understood by looking at previous dynasties and the most successful dynasties in China, they understood that the most successful dynasties had a very strong king. Some of them might have felt that it was actually in their own interest to have a healthy, functioning bureaucracy, which meant the dispersal of bureaucratic power. And others felt that there was a need to restore the balance of power within the government. So for all of these reasons, the central officials did go along with this. Another reason is because of the use of Confucianism as a political ideology. So this is the first time in Korean history where we have Confucian ideology adopted officially by the state. Now, I'm not sure how much you know of Confucianism, and we will get to Confucianism later in the course, but we are going to look at just the political aspects of Confucianism, because Confucianism is a very, very large body of scholarship. And like Christianity, there are hundreds and hundreds of different schools of Confucianism. And there's a very large body of scholarship within Confucianism that is dedicated to the art of good governments. So how to run a good government, how the king is supposed to behave, how its officials are supposed to behave. And these are based on ethical and moral principles. So the king, who is at the apex of power within society, is supposed to be a moral example for the rest of the country. If the king is moral, then his officials will follow that example, and then the people will follow that example. So this is kind of the basic ideas. But this means that the king then must master these Confucian principles in order to govern and to rule the people. But this is the key to creating a perfect society, is when the king is a moral example. The goal of Confucian governance is to achieve stability and harmony. So this means having a peaceful political order, a balance of power, and stability within the government, so that then this helps the people to achieve social harmony. So these ideas are regulated by certain values, such as loyalty and filial piety. So officials are very loyal to their king. The people are supposed to be loyal to their king, and the king is supposed to be a benevolent ruler and display his benevolence downward to his officials and to the people. So this is based on what is known as the 3 bonds and 5 relations in Confucian ideology. So there are 3 fundamental bonds, that is between ruler and minister, or the king and his officials, between parent and child, and between husband and wife. So these are 3 bonds, and then there are 5 relations between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, and between friend and friend. Now, these relationships are, within Confucian ideology, hierarchical. Confucius believed that it is natural for the ruler to be higher than the subject, for the father to be higher than the son, for the husband to be higher than the wife, for the elder brother to be higher than the younger brother. So because this is natural, this is universal, and this is moral. So these relations are hierarchical, but there's still an element of reciprocity. So the ruler needs to take care of his subjects and to constantly be aware of the needs of the subjects, while the subjects need to show loyalty and obedience to the ruler. So it's reciprocal. It's not even, it's hierarchical, but still reciprocal. So we have this hierarchy that is built into all relationships. And in order to achieve stability and harmony, this means that every single person must understand what their proper role and their proper place is in society. So if we think about these 3 bonds of 5 relations, every single person is involved in one or more of these relationships. There's no person that is not. So if you are, let's say, a government official, then you are a subject, you are also a father, you are also a son, you are also a husband, you are also a sibling, you are also a friend. But there's an appropriate set of behavior and responsibilities associated with each one of these roles. So when you are acting as a subject, then you need to behave in a certain way. You have certain responsibilities. When you are acting as a father, the same, and etc. When you do not understand what your proper place and what your proper role is, when the father starts acting like a younger sibling, or when the ruler starts acting like the subject, that's when we get chaos and society begins to break down. So in order for everybody to understand what their proper role is, this is achieved through self-cultivation, which means studying the Confucian classics and understanding, okay, well, when I'm behaving like a husband, I need to behave this way. When I'm behaving like a younger brother, I need to behave this way. And so this then includes family regulation. So the family needs to be ordered, and everybody within the family needs to understand what their proper role is, and then society will function properly, and then the country will prosper. So this is the basic principle of Confucian ideology. But since we are focusing on political history, let's look at this particular relationship between the ruler and his ministers. So the king, as I mentioned, is supposed to serve as a model of morality. He is supposed to be the ultimate moral example. But who teaches the king? These are certain government officials. So there is a Royal Confucian College, and officials who are Confucian scholars and well-versed, they are appointed as tutors to the crown prince. And so the crown princes are required to study, and they are influenced by these officials, and they are inculcated in Confucian ideology through the Royal Confucian College. And then when the crown prince becomes the king and takes the throne, then his officials will then advise him based on Confucian ideology. All right, so the results are that there were attempts to strengthen the kingship, as we saw, but Confucian ideology is so flexible that it can be used by both the king and the bureaucracy in order to justify their agenda. And we see this happening. So there are these debates within the court between the king and his officials over what kind of policies to enact. And so the king, if he was well versed in Confucianism, like Sejong, the fourth king of the Joseon dynasty, he was very well versed and was able to debate with Confucian scholars. And then we have these officials who are arguing on their side, also based on Confucian ideology. But over time, what we see is an increasing control among certain Yangban lineages, certain Yangban families. And they are able to monopolize the highest positions in the government and also to exert a lot of influence over the king. All right, so just to give you some context, when the Joseon dynasty was established, it was established immediately after the Ming dynasty was established. So we have a picture, a map here of the Ming Empire. And then when we get to the Mid dynasty at 644, the Ming were conquered by the Qing. And the Qing dynasty was established between 1644 and 1911. So in comparison, we have the Joseon dynasty that existed throughout the Ming and the Qing dynasty. So it was one long continuous dynasty. But on the Chinese mainland, we see the rise and fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing dynasty. So there's an overturn of dynasties. And then in comparison, we have, looking at Japan, the Edo or the Tokugawa period, which was established in 1603 and lasts until the late 19th century. And what preceded the Tokugawa period was a period of just sort of disrepair, and all of these feudal warlords, the daimyo, had pretty much been ruling independently, and the breakdown of Japan and the breakdown of a central government. So they were not able to really get their act together and centralize until the 17th century. So we see that in comparison with other political entities in the region, that the Joseon dynasty did end up being a long-lasting, stable, continuous government. All right, so looking at about mid-dynasty, beginning in the 16th century, what we see occurring is factional politics. Now, the factional politics, this occurred because there was disagreement amongst the officials over the correct Confucian policies that should be enacted. So to give you an example, let's say that the king, he designates as his heir, I'll give you a real historical example. So one of the kings designated, had his son as the heir, and this son proved to be highly incompetent. He was kind of a big dum-dum, didn't take his role seriously, neglected his studies of Confucianism, and the king could see that his son was going to be a terrible ruler. So what do you do in this case, right? How do you, and if you only have the one son that could possibly take over as the king, you don't have any brothers who could take over. It's the one incompetent son, and that's it. What do you do? So what he chose to do was he locked him inside a rice chest, and he eventually died. And it was his son, so the king's grandson, that ended up taking over. And the king's grandson was very bright, very intelligent, very conscientious, and he ended up being a really good ruler. But this stirred a lot of debate and controversy within the court, because there were officials who supported the king and there were officials who criticized the king and said that, what he did was immoral, and that you can't do this. And so there was this infighting, and it actually turned into like an ideological war amongst these different factions within the government. So they would argue each side based on Neo-Confucian doctrine and say, well, no, the king did the right thing because he was thinking about the country. And then the other side would say, no, this goes against Confucian principles where a parent is supposed to take care of their child. And so it was just very, very complicated and became extremely contentious and heated, and really divided the court because they were at each other's throats over this. So we have this kind of factional politics that emerged from the 16th century. Now, Yeongjo, he decided, because kings that preceded him, they would favor one faction over another. Obviously, if you were the faction that supported the king, then the king would show favor to you and appoint you to very high positions. So Yeongjo, when he took the throne in 1724, he decided to implement a policy of impartiality, which meant that he was not going to favor any particular faction, but appoint people equally. And because he reigned for about 50 years, almost half a century, this stabilized the situation and settled, things started to calm down within the court. And then there was Jeongjo, who continues this policy. And so we have, during the 18th century, for a period of almost 100 years, that we have this continuous policy and royal authority is enhanced. But this changes when we get towards the end, because this historical example that I gave to you was about Yeongjo and Jeongjo. And so even though they implemented these policies of impartiality, it did not erase the source of factionalism. So when Jeongjo dies, this begins the era of in-law government. Jeongjo dies, and what we see happening is very young kings coming to the throne, like basically boys. And when a child comes to the throne, the child can't run the government. And so who's making the decisions? Usually it's the eldest matriarch. And so like the Queen Dowager and her relatives then start making the political decisions. So when Jeongjo dies, we see the beginning of what is called this in-law government. Sunjo comes to the throne at the age of 10. And since a 10-year-old can't run a government, his mother, who is the regent, she starts to appoint family members to the highest positions in the government, and they dominate the power of the throne. And so Sunjo, he dies, and he doesn't have an heir. So there's a power struggle between two powerful Yangban families, the Andong Kim family and the Pungyang-jo family. And they both have married into the royal family, and so they start to struggle for power amongst themselves. But Hanjong, who was on the throne for about 15 years, he also dies without an heir. And so when he dies, the mother appoints Cheolcheong as the next king. And Cheolcheong was 18 years old when he came to the throne. And Cheolcheong, he also dies without a son. And so the senior woman within the family chooses Gojong. And so Gojong comes to the throne in 1864 at the age of 12. And his father decides at this point, okay, no more of this, queen dowager running the show. I'm taking over. So he gets rid of the Andong Kim family, who had been marrying into the royal family, and he takes power for himself. And he starts running the show until Gojong is old enough to really take the throne and to make decisions for himself. All right, so what we have then by the end of the 19th century, so towards the end of the Joseon dynasty, is we have this basically almost a century of in-law government with very weak kings. And what this then precipitated was widespread corruption within the government. Because when you have a weak king who's not really able to oversee things, and you have relatives of the queen who are dominating the highest positions in the government, they start trying to amass as much wealth and power for themselves, and neglecting the people, neglecting what's going on at the local level. And so there's widespread corruption within the government. There's high taxes, so you have these local officials that are extracting higher taxes than necessary and pocketing the difference. And so there's a very high, big burden on the peasantry because they're being taxed so much. And so what we see during the 19th century is the increase of popular rebellions. These commoners and peasants that are protesting this corruption and high taxation. And throughout the 19th century, these popular rebellions become more frequent and larger in scale. All right, so we're going to end the first part of the lecture here. So this gives you an overview of the Joseon dynasty political structure and the development of relations between the throne and the bureaucracy. And then in the next part of the lecture, we're going to look at foreign relations.